My name is Beverly, and I'm 32 years old. Standing in my parents' living room before our annual family gathering, I smoothed down my modest dress and tried to calm the familiar knot in my stomach. This was supposed to be a celebration, but something felt different this time. There was an energy in the air, a sense that tonight would change everything. I'd built my art therapy business from nothing, finally helping underprivileged children find their voices through creativity. Maybe, just maybe, my parents would finally see that I'd made something meaningful of my life. But as I watched my brother Kenneth pull up in his latest luxury car, that old familiar feeling of being the family disappointment crept back in. What I didn't know was that my grandmother Rose had been quietly planning something that would turn our entire family upside down. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, because what happened next at that family dinner will shock you to your core. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Portland, Oregon, I learned early that love in the Morrison family came with conditions. My father Harold had built his corporate empire through ruthless determination and an obsession with measurable success. My mother Patricia moved in social circles where your children's achievements were currency traded at charity luncheons and country club gatherings like stocks on Wall Street. From the time we could walk, Kenneth and I were being groomed for different destinies. He was the golden child, excelling effortlessly at everything our parents valued. Academic honors, athletic achievements, leadership positions that looked impressive on college applications. I was the dreamer, the sensitive one who spent hours drawing in sketchbooks, while Kenneth studied for advanced placement tests. Kenneth sailed through private school with perfect grades, captain of the debate team, president of the student council. His acceptance to Harvard for business school was celebrated with a champagne dinner that lasted 3 hours. My acceptance to Portland State for art therapy was met with resigned sighs and comments about finding yourself before getting serious about life. The favoritism wasn't subtle. Kenneth got the new car for graduation, while I got a lecture about responsibility. His college tuition was paid in full while I worked 3 part-time jobs to cover my expenses. When he graduated, summa cum laude, the celebration party had 200 guests. When I earned my master's degree in art therapy, we had dinner at a mid-range restaurant where my parents spent most of the meal asking Kenneth about his job prospects. But it was my grandmother Rose who saw something different in me. Harold's mother was a sharp, independent woman who'd raised her son as a single mother after her husband died young. She had a quiet strength that commanded respect even from my intimidating father. While my parents dismissed my career choice as impractical dreaming, Rose would ask detailed questions about my work with children who'd experienced trauma. Rose had her own mysterious past that she rarely discussed. I knew she'd worked as a bookkeeper for various businesses, lived modestly in a small house across town, and somehow managed to put Harold through law school as a single mother. What I didn't know was how much she'd been quietly observing our family dynamics, taking careful note of every slight, every dismissal, every moment when my parents showed their true priorities. My art therapy practice had grown slowly but steadily over the past 5 years. Working with children who'd experienced abuse, neglect, or trauma, I helped them process their emotions through creative expression. It wasn't the kind of work that impressed people at cocktail parties, but it was deeply meaningful. Kids who hadn't spoken in months would open up through finger painting. Teenagers who'd been written off as troublemakers would discover their voices through sculpture. Kenneth, meanwhile, had climbed the corporate ladder at a prestigious investment firm. His Harvard MBA and natural aggressiveness made him perfect for the world of high-stakes finance. He bought expensive suits, drove luxury cars, and lived in a downtown penthouse that cost more per month than I made in 6. Our parents couldn't have been prouder. The annual family dinner had become a tradition none of us particularly enjoyed, but all felt obligated to attend. It was Harold's way of maintaining family unity, while Patricia used it as an opportunity to show off their latest home improvements to whoever would listen. This year's invitation had been different, though. Instead of the usual casual summons, formal invitations arrived with mentions of important family business and exciting announcements. Rose's decision to attend this year was unusual. At 78, she'd been dealing with some health issues and typically preferred quiet family visits to large gatherings. But when I called to see if she needed a ride, her voice had an edge of determination I'd never heard before. She insisted on driving herself and made cryptic comments about it being time for some family truths to come to light. As I stood in that familiar living room, surrounded by expensive furniture and family photos that told the story of Kenneth's achievements, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be different. The legal folders on my father's desk, the way my parents kept exchanging meaningful glances, the nervous energy that seemed to fill the house like static electricity before a storm. I had no idea that my grandmother had been making plans of her own plans that would change everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and where I truly belonged in the Morrison legacy. The first thing I noticed when Kenneth arrived was his new watch, a Rolex that probably cost more than most people's cars. He strode through the front door like he owned the place, which, given tonight's announcement, maybe he soon would. His wife Janet followed behind him, her designer dress perfectly coordinated with her handbag and shoes, looking like she'd stepped off the pages of a fashion magazine. My parents' reactions to our arrivals couldn't have been more different. When Kenneth walked in, Harold practically beamed, pumping his hand in that hearty businessman's handshake, while Patricia fussed over Janet's outfit and asked about their recent vacation to Italy. When I'd arrived 30 minutes earlier, I'd gotten polite nods and comments about traffic, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than their daughter. The contrast stung, but it wasn't surprising. What did surprise me was seeing Grandmother Rose's sharp blue eyes, tracking every interaction, cataloging every slight with the precision of a court stenographer. She sat in Harold's favorite armchair, having claimed it the moment she arrived, and watched the family dynamics unfold with an expression I couldn't quite read. Kenneth immediately launched into stories about his latest promotion to senior partner, the million-dollar deals he'd been closing, and the new investment opportunities that had everyone at his firm buzzing with excitement. Harold hung on every word, asking detailed questions about market projections and profit margins. Patricia chimed in with proud comments about how wonderful it was to have such a successful son. When there was a brief lull in Kenneth's monologue, I tried to share some news about my own business. 3 months ago, I'd secured a grant to expand my art therapy program to 2 additional community centers. It was a huge win that would let me help 60 more children each week. But the moment I started speaking, I could see Harold's eyes glaze over and Patricia begin fidgeting with her jewelry. "That's nice, dear," Patricia said in the tone people use for children showing off crayon drawings. "It's good that you're keeping busy with your little projects." Kenneth smirked. "Still playing with finger paints, Bev? When are you going to grow up and get a real job?" The comment hit exactly the way he'd intended. But before I could respond, Rose spoke up in a voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Kenneth, perhaps you could explain to me what makes helping traumatized children recover their sense of safety and self-worth less real than shuffling numbers around to make rich people richer." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Kenneth's face flushed red, but he didn't have a ready comeback for Rose's question. Harold cleared his throat awkwardly, while Patricia suddenly became very interested in adjusting the flower arrangement on the side table. Rose turned to me with genuine warmth. "Beverly, tell me more about this grant you mentioned. Which organizations are you partnering with?" For the next 10 minutes, Rose asked thoughtful questions about my work, showing the kind of interest and understanding my parents had never demonstrated. She wanted to know about the specific techniques I used, the success rates for different types of trauma, and how I measured progress in children who couldn't always articulate their feelings. As we talked, I noticed my parents growing increasingly restless. This wasn't how family gatherings were supposed to go. Kenneth was supposed to be the center of attention, the success story they could brag about to their friends. My work wasn't supposed to be treated as equally valuable or important. Harold finally interrupted by announcing it was time to move to the dining room. The formal table was set with Patricia's best china and crystal, the kind reserved for truly special occasions. Candles flickered in silver holders, and everything gleamed under the chandelier that had cost more than some people's annual salaries. but it was what I saw on the sideboard that made my stomach clench with foreboding. Legal folders thick with documents sat next to a bottle of champagne that was clearly meant for celebrating. Whatever announcement my parents had planned, it involved lawyers and paperwork, and the champagne suggested they expected everyone to be happy about it. As we took our seats, I found myself positioned across from Kenneth with my parents at the head and foot of the table, like the king and queen of their domestic kingdom. Rose had somehow managed to claim the seat next to me close enough that I could feel her steady presence like an anchor in what was clearly going to be rough waters. The dinner service began with Harold and Patricia practically glowing with anticipation, exchanging meaningful looks and barely contained excitement. Kenneth seemed to know what was coming, sitting back in his chair, with the satisfied air of someone who'd already won a game the other players didn't know they were playing. And Rose, bless her heart, watched it all unfold with the keen attention of someone who'd seen this particular play performed before and was waiting for her cue to step onto the stage. The meal itself was a masterpiece of expensive ingredients and professional preparation, the kind of dinner Patricia ordered from the exclusive catering company she used for all her important entertaining. Lobster bisque filet mignon with truffle sauce wines that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a week. Everything designed to impress and remind everyone present of the Morrison family's financial success. But the real feast was the conversation, if you could call it that. Kenneth dominated the discussion with detailed accounts of his recent achievements, each story more impressive than the last. He'd just closed a deal that netted his firm $12 million in profits. His client portfolio was expanding faster than he could manage. The partners were already talking about giving him his own division. Harold listened with the pride of a man watching his life's work validated through his son's success. "You know, Kenneth, when I was your age, I was still struggling to make partner myself. You're already surpassing anything I accomplished at that stage." Patricia beamed. "We're just so proud. All those years of private school and Harvard were clearly worth every penny. You've turned into exactly the kind of man we always knew you could be." Their praise was lavish, specific, and genuine. They asked follow-up questions, requested details about his strategies, and hung on every word like he was dispensing wisdom from Mount Olympus. Kenneth basked in their attention, growing more confident and expansive with each compliment. Meanwhile, my attempts to contribute to the conversation were met with polite but minimal responses. When I mentioned that my program had achieved a 90% success rate in helping children return to regular classroom settings, Harold nodded absently and immediately turned back to asking Kenneth about his investment philosophy. When I tried to share that the mayor's office had contacted me about consulting on a citywide trauma-informed care initiative, Patricia smiled vaguely and commented that it was nice I was staying involved in the community before launching into questions about Janet's latest shopping trip to San Francisco. The message was clear. Kenneth's achievements mattered. Mine were just cute hobbies that polite people acknowledged before moving on to real conversation. But Rose wasn't having any of it. Every time my parents dismissed something, I said she would circle back with detailed questions that demonstrated not just interest, but genuine understanding of the complexities involved in my work. "Beverly," Rose said during a lull in Kenneth's latest story, "that trauma-informed care initiative sounds fascinating. Are you developing the training protocols yourself or working with existing frameworks?" It was exactly the kind of technical question that showed she'd been paying attention, that she understood this was real professional work requiring expertise and skill. As I explained the research base behind different therapeutic approaches, I saw Harold's jaw tighten with irritation at the continued focus on my career. Kenneth, never one to let attention stray from him for long, jumped in with a condescending laugh. "Honestly, Bev, all this psychology stuff sounds pretty soft to me. I mean, how do you even measure success when you're dealing with feelings instead of actual numbers?" It was such a perfectly Kenneth thing to say, dismissing an entire field of scientific research because it didn't fit his narrow definition of measurable achievement. But before I could respond, Rose set down her wine glass with enough force to make the crystal ring like a bell. "Kenneth," she said in a voice that could have frozen water, "perhaps you could explain to me how your measurable success at moving money around has helped even one child sleep better at night, or feel safe enough to learn in school. The table went dead silent. Kenneth's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Harold and Patricia looked horrified that anyone would challenge their golden child so directly. Janet suddenly became very interested in her salad, but Rose wasn't finished. Beverly's work creates measurable changes in real human lives. Children who couldn't function in classrooms are now thriving academically. Families torn apart by trauma are healing and staying together. That seems far more substantial than profit margins to me. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. This wasn't how dinner conversations went in the Morrison household. Kenneth was supposed to be praised and challenged. I was supposed to be quietly grateful for whatever scraps of attention came my way. Harold cleared his throat loudly, clearly desperate to regain control of the situation. Well, speaking of measurable success, I think it's time we shared our exciting news. He stood up, reaching for the legal folders on the sideboard, and I felt my stomach drop toward my shoes. Whatever was about to happen, the satisfaction on Kenneth's face and the anticipatory gleam in my parents' eyes told me it wasn't going to be good news for me. Patricia practically vibrated with excitement as Harold returned to the table with the documents. We have a wonderful announcement that we've been planning for months. And that's when my world fell apart. Harold stood at the head of the table like a CEO addressing his board of directors, the legal documents spread before him like a battle plan. His chest was puffed out with pride and self-importance, and Patricia couldn't stop smiling as if she were about to announce the winner of some cosmic lottery. As you all know, Harold began, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for business presentations. Patricia and I have worked very hard over the years to build our financial security. Last month, I completed the sale of my consulting firm to a major corporation, and we now find ourselves in the fortunate position of having significant assets to distribute. My heart started beating faster. I'd known about the business sale, of course, but Harold had never mentioned anything about distributing the proceeds to family members. A tiny, ridiculous part of me wondered if this might finally be the moment when my parents acknowledged that I deserved some recognition, some tangible proof that I mattered to them. Kenneth was trying to look modest, but his smug expression gave him away. Clearly, he already knew what was coming. Janet was practically glowing with anticipation, probably already mentally redecorating their penthouse with their unexpected windfall. After much consideration and discussion with our financial advisors, Harold continued, we've decided to give the full proceeds from the sale $1.3 million to Kenneth. The words hit me like a physical blow, $1.3 million to Kenneth. The full amount. I felt the air leave my lungs and had to grip the edge of the table to keep myself steady. Patricia jumped in with barely contained excitement. Kenneth has proven himself to be financially responsible and successful. He's made smart investment choices, built a stable career, and shown the kind of judgment we can trust with this kind of money. Harold nodded gravely, as if he were making some profound pronouncement about the nature of human character. We believe this investment in Kenneth's future will yield the best returns for the entire family. He's already discussed some excellent opportunities that could potentially double or triple the initial amount. Kenneth finally spoke, his voice dripping with false humility. I'm honored by your confidence in me. I promise I'll invest this wisely and make sure it grows into something even more substantial for future generations. The room started spinning. I sat there completely stunned, trying to process what I was hearing. Not only was I getting nothing, but my parents were framing Kenneth's windfall as somehow benefiting the entire family, as if I should be grateful that my brother was getting money that would theoretically grow and maybe someday trickle down to benefit everyone. But they weren't done yet. The worst was still coming. Patricia turned to me with the kind of expression people wear when they're about to put a sick animal out of its misery. Beverly, we need you to understand why we made this decision. Harold picked up the thread with the ruthless efficiency of a man who'd spent decades delivering bad news to underperforming employees. You've made choices throughout your life that show a fundamental lack of understanding about financial responsibility and practical success. The words kept coming, each one designed for maximum damage. Your career choice was impractical from the beginning. Art therapy, working with underprivileged children, these aren't sustainable paths to financial security. Patricia nodded along like a Greek chorus of disappointment. We've watched you struggle for years, barely making ends meet living in that tiny apartment driving that old car. You're 32 years old, Beverly, and you have nothing to show for it. Kenneth couldn't resist adding his own commentary. Let's be honest, Bev. You're a failure. You've had the same advantages I had, the same education opportunities, the same family support. But you chose to waste your potential on this feel-good nonsense instead of building something real. The final blow came from Harold, delivered with the cold precision of a judge reading a death sentence. You're a failure. You've proven you can't handle money or make smart decisions. We're not going to enable your poor choices by throwing good money after bad. You need to handle your own life. The silence that followed was deafening. Kenneth and my parents looked satisfied, like they'd just completed some unpleasant but necessary task. Janet avoided eye contact, probably embarrassed by the cruelty she'd just witnessed. And I sat there completely destroyed, feeling like that little girl again who could never quite measure up to her perfect older brother. But then I heard a chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and I looked up to see Grandmother Rose slowly rising to her feet. At 78, she was still an imposing figure when she wanted to be, and right now she looked like an avenging angel preparing for battle. Now it's my turn, she said, and her voice carried an authority that made everyone else at the table freeze in place. The transformation in Rose was remarkable to witness. The quiet, observant elderly woman who'd been sitting beside me throughout dinner suddenly commanded the room with a presence that made everyone else shrink back in their chairs. She stood tall despite her age, her spine straight, and her eyes blazing with an intensity that could have melted steel. Harold Morrison, she said, and the way she spoke my father's full name made it sound like a formal indictment. I have never been more ashamed to call you my son than I am right now. Harold's face went pale. In all my years, I'd never heard Rose speak to him with anything approaching criticism, let alone this kind of withering condemnation. He started to sputter some kind of response, but Rose held up a hand that brooked no interruption. Sit down and listen, because what I'm about to say will change everything you think you know about this family. Patricia looked like she wanted to object, but something in Rose's expression warned her that this was not the time to test boundaries. Kenneth had lost his smug confidence and was shifting nervously in his seat. Even Janet seemed to understand that whatever was happening was far more significant than a typical family disagreement. Rose turned to face the entire table, but her eyes lingered on me with a warmth that felt like a lifeline in the emotional wreckage my parents had just created. I've spent the last hour listening to three supposedly intelligent adults destroy a remarkable young woman with their ignorance and cruelty. She began to pace slowly around the table, and I was reminded of a prosecutor building a case before a jury. Beverly, you've been told tonight that you're a failure. Let me tell you what failure actually looks like. Rose stopped behind Harold's chair, her hands resting on the back of it like she was claiming territory. Failure is raising a child so obsessed with money and status that he thinks human worth is measured by bank account balances. Failure is creating a family environment so toxic that love becomes conditional on meeting arbitrary standards of success. Harold tried to interrupt. Mother, you don't understand the complexities of... I understand perfectly, Rose cut him off. I understand that you've forgotten everything I taught you about character and compassion. I understand that you've let greed and social status corrupt your judgment about what really matters in life. She moved to stand behind Kenneth's chair next. And you, Kenneth. You sit there smugly accepting money you didn't earn while participating in the emotional destruction of your own sister. You call Beverly a failure. Let me tell you about real failure. Kenneth's face was turning red, but he didn't dare speak. Rose's voice grew stronger with each word. Real failure is being so spiritually bankrupt that you can't recognize genuine goodness when it's sitting right across from you. Real failure is having every advantage in life and using them to become nothing more than a well-dressed parasite. Patricia gasped. Rose, how dare you speak to our son that way? Rose whirled on her with eyes that flashed like lightning. Patricia, you dare question me? You who just spent 20 minutes systematically destroying your own daughter's self-worth, you who values Kenneth's ability to manipulate money more than Beverly's ability to heal broken children. The room fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of people who knew they were witnessing something historic, something that would be talked about for years to come. Rose walked back to her chair but remained standing, her hands gripping the back of it for support. I've been quiet for too long, she said, her voice growing softer but more intense. I've watched this family tear itself apart with favoritism and materialism. I've seen a beautiful, compassionate young woman doubt her own worth because the people who should love her unconditionally have spent her entire life telling her she's not good enough. Rose looked directly at me, and for the first time all evening, I felt like someone really saw me. Beverly, your parents just gave Kenneth $1.3 million. They called you a failure and told you to handle your own life. She paused for dramatic effect, and I could see something shifting in her expression, a decision being made in real time. Well, I have some news of my own to share. Harold found his voice again. Mother, what are you talking about? Rose smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made me think of generals who just realized they held all the winning cards. I'm talking about the $2.7 million I've accumulated over the past 40 years through careful investing and smart financial planning. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. $2.7 million. Rose had $2.7 million. Kenneth's jaw dropped open. Patricia made a small choking sound. Harold looked like he'd been struck by lightning, and I sat there stunned, wondering how my quiet grandmother had secretly amassed a fortune that dwarfed what my parents had just given to Kenneth. Rose wasn't finished with her revelations. Money I've been planning to leave to my family. Money I've been very carefully considering how to distribute among my descendants. She paused again, letting the implications sink in. Money that as of tonight will be going entirely to Beverly. The chaos that erupted around the dinner table was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in the Morrison family's normally controlled environment. Harold shot out of his chair so fast, he knocked over his wine glass, sending burgundy liquid spreading across Patricia's pristine white tablecloth. Kenneth's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that suggested his blood pressure had reached dangerous levels. That's impossible, Kenneth shouted, his composure completely shattered. You live in that little house, you drive that old car, you never spend money on anything. Rose regarded him with the calm satisfaction of someone who just played a winning hand in poker. Exactly, Kenneth. While your parents were spending everything they earned on status symbols and keeping up appearances, I was living below my means and investing the difference. Patricia had recovered from her initial shock and was now frantically trying to control the situation. Rose, surely you can't be serious. You can't just make impulsive decisions about that kind of money based on one family argument. Impulsive? Rose's eyebrows shot up toward her silver hairline. Patricia, I've been watching this family's dynamics for 32 years. I've seen every slight, every dismissal, every moment when Beverly's achievements were minimized while Kenneth's were celebrated. This decision is the opposite of impulsive. Harold was pacing behind his chair like a caged animal, his business-minded brain clearly trying to calculate angles and find leverage. Mother, you're not thinking clearly. That money should be distributed fairly among all family members. Beverly hasn't shown the kind of financial responsibility that would justify. Financial responsibility. Rose's voice cracked like a whip. Harold, your daughter built a successful business from nothing. She's expanded it through grants and partnerships, created jobs for other therapists, and developed programs that are being studied by universities. But because she chose to help people instead of exploit them, you call her financially irresponsible. I sat there in complete shock, barely able to process what was happening. Rose's support felt like warm sunlight after years of living in emotional winter. But the amount of money involved was staggering, almost incomprehensible. $2.7 million. It was more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. Kenneth had found his voice again, and his entitled rage was in full display. This isn't fair. I'm the one who's proven himself in the business world. I'm the one who understands investments and financial planning. Beverly will just waste it on her feel-good projects. Rose turned on him with the fury of a protective mother bear. Kenneth, the fact that you think helping traumatized children is a waste of money tells me everything I need to know about your character. Or rather, your complete lack of character. She walked over to the sideboard where Harold had left the legal documents announcing Kenneth's inheritance. With deliberate precision, she picked up the papers and began reading through them, her expression growing more disgusted with each page. $1.3 million, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Given to a man who already has more money than he knows what to do with, who drives cars worth more than most people's houses, who measures his worth by how much he can accumulate. Rose set the documents down and looked directly at Kenneth. You want to know about financial responsibility? Beverly has been supporting herself entirely through her own work for years. She's never asked for handouts or bailouts. She built something meaningful from nothing while you've been climbing corporate ladders built by other people. Patricia was growing desperate, her voice taking on the wheedling tone she used when she wanted something. Rose, surely you can see that dividing the money more equally would be the fairest approach. Perhaps Beverly could receive a portion for her business, but no. The single word from Rose cut through Patricia's scheming like a sword. Beverly will receive everything. Every penny of my estate will go to someone who understands that money is a tool for creating positive change, not just a way to keep score in some meaningless game. Harold tried a different approach, his voice taking on the manipulative tone he used in business negotiations. Mother, you're obviously upset about tonight's announcement, but making emotional decisions about this kind of money isn't wise. Why don't we all take some time to cool down and discuss this rationally? Rose laughed, but there was no humor in it. Rational, Harold. What's rational is recognizing that I raised a son who's forgotten everything I taught him about compassion and fairness. What's rational is ensuring my money goes to someone who will use it to make the world better instead of just making themselves richer. She walked back to stand beside my chair, and I felt her hand rest gently on my shoulder. The simple gesture of support meant more to me than all the money in the world. Beverly, I've watched you sacrifice your own comfort to help children who have nothing. I've seen you turn down higher-paying jobs because you believe your work is too important to abandon. Rose's voice grew tender as she continued. I've watched you question your own worth because 3 people who should love you unconditionally have spent your entire life telling you that kindness is weakness and that success can only be measured in dollars. Kenneth made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Grandmother, you don't understand how the real world works. Beverly's bleeding heart approach to life isn't sustainable. She needs someone to manage her finances to help her make smart investments. Rose's response was swift and final. Kenneth Beverly has demonstrated more wisdom about what really matters in 32 years than you've shown in your entire life. She'll figure out the money. What you'll never figure out is how to be a decent human being. The devastation on my family's faces was complete. Their carefully planned evening of celebration had turned into a nightmare of reversed fortunes and exposed character flaws. But for me, sitting there with Rose's hand on my shoulder, it felt like the first honest moment our family had shared in decades. The immediate aftermath of Rose's announcement was like watching a carefully constructed house of cards collapse in slow motion. Harold, Patricia, and Kenneth seemed to cycle through the stages of grief at warp speed, moving from denial to anger to bargaining with dizzying intensity. Patricia was the first to try damage control, her voice taking on the artificially sweet tone she used when she wanted to manipulate someone into doing what she wanted. Rose, darling, perhaps we've all gotten a bit emotional tonight. Why don't we sleep on this and discuss it more rationally tomorrow? But Rose was having none of it. She'd clearly been planning this moment for longer than any of us had realized, and she wasn't about to let anyone talk her out of it. Patricia, the only thing I need to sleep on is the satisfaction of finally standing up to the bullies in my own family. Kenneth tried a different approach, appealing to what he assumed were Rose's practical sensibilities. Grandmother, even if you want to help Beverly, surely you can see that giving her that much money all at once isn't wise. She has no experience managing large investments or dealing with that level of financial responsibility. Rose's response was swift and cutting. Kenneth Beverly has been managing tight budgets and making smart financial decisions for years. She's built a sustainable business model, secured grants through competitive processes, and created programs that generate ongoing revenue. What experience do you have with anything other than moving other people's money around for your own profit? Harold was growing increasingly agitated, pacing around the dining room like a caged predator. His business mind was clearly working overtime, trying to find some angle or leverage that could change the situation. Mother, you're making this decision based on emotion rather than logic. Beverly hasn't proven she can handle this kind of responsibility. Responsibility? Rose's voice rose to a level I'd rarely heard from her. Harold, your daughter has been responsible for healing traumatized children, for keeping families together, for creating safe spaces for society's most vulnerable members. Meanwhile, your golden boy son here has been responsible for making rich people richer, moving money from one account to another. I sat there feeling like I was watching this unfold from outside my own body. The enormity of what Rose was offering felt surreal, but even more overwhelming was the fierce protection and advocacy she was showing on my behalf. For 32 years, I'd never had anyone defend me like this, never had someone see my worth so clearly and articulate it so powerfully. Rose wasn't finished with her defense of my character and achievements. She turned to address the entire table, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived long enough to understand what really mattered in life. Let me tell you all something about real success, she said, her eyes moving from Harold to Patricia to Kenneth. Real success is measured by the positive impact you have on other people's lives. It's measured by the problems you solve, the pain you heal, the hope you create. She gestured toward me with obvious pride. Beverly has helped hundreds of children overcome trauma that could have destroyed their entire lives. She's kept families together that might have been torn apart by abuse and neglect. She's created programs that other cities are now copying because they work. Kenneth couldn't help himself from interjecting with his narrow worldview. But grandmother, none of that pays the bills or builds long-term security. You can't eat good intentions or pay rent with warm feelings. Rose's response was like watching a master chess player deliver checkmate. Kenneth Beverly has been paying her bills just fine, thank you very much. She owns her business, employs other people, and has been expanding steadily for years. The difference is that she's built something sustainable that serves a real purpose instead of just extracting profit from other people's work. Patricia made one more attempt to appeal to Rose's sense of family loyalty. Rose, surely you can understand our position. We've invested so much in Kenneth's education and development. We had plans for that money, important plans, that would benefit the whole family. Rose's laugh was sharp and bitter. Patricia, your plans involved publicly humiliating one child, while rewarding another for achievements that required no sacrifice, no compassion, and no real contribution to society. Your plans were cruel and short-sighted. Harold's frustration was reaching a boiling point. Mother, you're being completely unreasonable. Beverly chose her path knowing it wasn't financially lucrative. She can't expect to be rewarded for making impractical choices. Impractical? Rose's voice could have cut glass. Harold Beverly chose a path that requires advanced education, specialized training, and enormous emotional strength. She chose work that society desperately needs, but doesn't value properly. That's not impractical, that's heroic. The conversation was interrupted by Rose walking over to her purse and pulling out her cell phone. You know what, I've heard enough arguing for one evening. Beverly, would you mind driving me home? I have some calls to make to my attorney tonight. The finality in her voice was unmistakable. Harold, Patricia, and Kenneth could argue and scheme all they wanted, but Rose was done listening. She was ready to take action. As we prepared to leave, I caught a glimpse of my family's faces. The shock was still there, but it was being rapidly replaced by a calculating look that suggested they were already plotting ways to contest Rose's decision or manipulate the situation to their advantage. But Rose had one more surprise in store for them. Oh, and Harold. Just so we're all clear, I've been documenting this family's treatment of Beverly for years. Every slight, every dismissal, every cruel comment. My attorney has quite a file on the emotional abuse that's been happening at these family gatherings. She smiled sweetly at their horrified expressions. So if anyone is thinking about trying to challenge my decisions legally, they might want to consider how those documented patterns of behavior would look to a judge. With that parting shot, Rose took my arm and headed for the door, leaving behind three people whose comfortable world of assumptions and entitlements had just been completely shattered. The drive to Rose's house was filled with a silence that felt more comfortable than any conversation I'd had with my family in years. My mind was reeling from everything that had happened, trying to process the emotional whiplash of going from public humiliation to unexpected vindication in the span of an hour. Rose sat beside me in the passenger seat, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her all evening. The fierce protector who dominated that dining room had been replaced by the gentle grandmother I'd always known, but there was a new lightness to her demeanor, as if standing up to Harold had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for decades. You're probably wondering how a woman who clips coupons and drives a 15-year-old Toyota managed to accumulate $2.7 million, she said as we pulled into her driveway. I had been wondering exactly that, among about 1,000 other questions. Rose's modest lifestyle had never suggested hidden wealth. Her small house was comfortable but far from luxurious, and I'd never seen her spend money on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. I started investing when your father was still in high school, Rose explained as we sat in her cozy living room. Back then, women weren't supposed to understand money or make financial decisions, but I'd been managing household budgets and bookkeeping for local businesses since your grandfather died. She made tea while she talked her movements sure and economical. I lived on half my income and invested the rest. Index funds, mostly nothing fancy or risky. Compound interest is a powerful thing when you give it 40 years to work. The numbers were staggering when I tried to wrap my head around them. Decades of consistent investing living below her means making smart but conservative choices, while the rest of the family focused on spending and status. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? I asked. Harold always talks about family financial planning and investment strategies. He has no idea you know more about building wealth than he does. Rose's smile was enigmatic. Beverly knowledge is power, but only if you're careful about who you share it with. I watched your father turn into someone I barely recognized as he climbed the corporate ladder. Money changed him, made him harder and more judgmental. I didn't want him making decisions about my future based on what he thought I should do with my money. She handed me a cup of tea and settled into her favorite armchair. Besides, I knew this day would come eventually. I knew Harold would choose Kenneth over you when it came time to distribute wealth. I've been watching that favoritism destroy your self-confidence for 32 years, and I've been planning to do something about it. The revelation that Rose had been strategically preparing for this moment for years was almost as shocking as the money itself. She'd been playing a long game, quietly building resources while documenting the family dynamics that led to tonight's confrontation. Rose, I said carefully, I can't accept $2.7 million. It's too much. It's more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Her response was immediate and firm. Beverly, you can and you will accept it. Not because you need the money, but because you've earned it through 32 years of being the kind of person who deserves to have resources to pursue your dreams. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes intense with conviction. Do you know what you could do with that money? You could open centers in every underserved neighborhood in the city. You could fund research into new therapeutic techniques. You could create scholarships for other young people who want to go into helping professions but can't afford the education. The possibilities she was describing were breathtaking. With that kind of financial backing, I could expand my work beyond anything I'd ever imagined. Instead of helping 60 children at a time, I could potentially help thousands. But what about Harold and Kenneth? I asked. They're going to fight this. They're going to make both our lives miserable. Rose's expression hardened slightly. Beverly bullies only have power if you give it to them. Harold can be angry all he wants, but he can't change the fact that I'm a competent adult who has every right to distribute my assets as I see fit. She got up and walked to her desk, pulling out a thick folder that she'd clearly prepared in advance. My attorney has been helping me structure this for months. The documentation is ironclad, and there are specific provisions to prevent family members from contesting the will based on claims of undue influence or mental incompetence. The folder contained legal documents, but also something more personal. Rose pulled out a handwritten letter and handed it to me. This is for you to read later when you've had time to process everything that happened tonight. But I want you to know that every decision I've made has been based on watching you grow into exactly the kind of person I hoped you'd become. We talked for another hour about practical matters. Rose had already spoken with financial advisors about setting up trusts and investment accounts that would provide ongoing income while preserving the principal. She'd researched tax implications and legal structures that would protect the money from being tied up in family disputes. The most important thing, she said as our conversation wound down, is that you understand this isn't about the money. This is about recognizing your worth and giving you the tools to amplify the good work you're already doing. As I prepared to leave, Rose walked me to the door and took my hands in hers. Beverly, your parents told you tonight that you're a failure. I want you to remember that failure is not about how much money you have or what other people think of your choices. Her voice grew soft but determined. Failure is living your life according to other people's values instead of your own. Success is knowing that you've used your gifts to make the world a little bit better than you found it. Driving home that night, I felt like I was emerging from a fog that had obscured my vision for decades. Rose's gift wasn't just financial. It was the validation that my choices had meaning, that my work had value, that I didn't need to apologize for choosing compassion over profit. The money would change my life in practical ways, but Rose's fierce defense of my character had already changed something more fundamental. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly seen and valued for who I was, not dismissed for who I wasn't. The weeks following that dinner brought changes I never could have anticipated. Rose wasted no time in making her intentions legally binding, and within days, I found myself sitting in a law office listening to attorneys explain trust structures and investment strategies that would have sounded like science fiction to me just a month earlier. But the most profound change wasn't financial. It was emotional. Rose's unwavering support had shattered the foundation of self-doubt that my family had spent decades constructing. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't questioning whether my work mattered or whether I'd made the right choices. I knew with absolute certainty that helping traumatized children heal was not just valid work, but essential work. My family's reaction was predictably ugly. Harold called repeatedly, alternating between angry demands and manipulative attempts to guilt me into doing the right thing and sharing the inheritance. Patricia tried a different approach, suddenly wanting to schedule lunch dates and mother-daughter shopping trips as if we could magically become close now that I had access to resources. Kenneth's response was the most telling. His texts and voicemails revealed a level of entitlement and rage that was honestly frightening. He seemed genuinely unable to comprehend why Rose would choose to support my work over his accumulation of wealth. In his worldview, money was supposed to flow toward more money, not toward social programs that couldn't be measured in profit margins. But Rose had prepared me for their reactions. She'd spent years watching the family dynamics that led to this moment, and she'd documented patterns of behavior that made their sudden interest in fairness and family unity look transparently self-serving. Beverly, she told me during one of our weekly dinners, narcissistic people don't change just because circumstances change. They just adjust their manipulation tactics. Harold, Patricia, and Kenneth are exactly the same people they were before. They're just scrambling to find new ways to get what they want. She was right, of course. None of them had apologized for the cruel things they'd said at dinner. None of them had acknowledged that their treatment of me had been unfair or hurtful. They were simply recalibrating their approach now that I had something they wanted. The transformation in my work was immediate and dramatic. With Rose's financial backing, I was able to hire 3 additional therapists and open satellite offices in 2 underserved neighborhoods. The waiting list for our services, which had stretched for months, was suddenly manageable. Children who'd been languishing in overcrowded programs were getting the individualized attention they needed. More importantly, I was able to start saying yes to opportunities I'd never been able to afford before. Research partnerships with universities, pilot programs with innovative techniques, training workshops that would help other therapists develop trauma-informed practices. The money was giving me the freedom to think bigger than I'd ever allowed myself to dream. Rose threw herself into supporting the expansion with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found the perfect outlet for decades of accumulated resources. She attended staff meetings, visited our new locations, and even started volunteering to read to some of the younger children in our programs. "You know what I love most about this," she told me, as we watched a group of kids working on a collaborative mural project. "Every dollar we spend here creates a ripple effect that will improve dozens of lives. These children will grow up more stable, more confident, better able to form healthy relationships, and contribute to their communities." She gestured toward the colorful artwork covering the walls. "Kenneth spends more on a single business dinner than we spend helping a child process trauma and develop coping skills. But his dinner is forgotten by morning, while our work here changes the entire trajectory of a human life." The research component of our expanded program was particularly exciting. We were partnering with the university's psychology department to study long-term outcomes for children who received intensive art therapy intervention versus traditional talk therapy approaches. Early results suggested that creative expression helped kids process trauma in ways that purely verbal methods couldn't match. 6 months after that transformative dinner, I found myself presenting our preliminary findings at a national conference on childhood trauma. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of researchers, clinicians, and policymakers, I felt a profound sense of purpose that had nothing to do with external validation and everything to do with knowing I was contributing something meaningful to the world. Rose was in the front row, beaming with pride, as I described how financial investment in trauma-informed care could prevent generations of mental health problems, substance abuse, and family dysfunction. The questions from the audience were thoughtful and engaged, focused on replication and scaling, rather than skeptical challenges to the work's validity. That evening, as Rose and I celebrated at a quiet restaurant near the conference hotel, she raised her glass in a toast to understanding that success isn't about impressing people who don't matter, but about creating value for people who do. We clinked glasses, and I realized that the woman sitting across from me had given me something far more valuable than money. She'd given me the confidence to value my own judgment, to trust my instincts about what mattered, and to stop seeking approval from people whose values were fundamentally opposed to everything I believed in. "Rose," I said, "I need you to know that the money is wonderful, but what you really gave me was permission to stop apologizing for who I am." Her smile was radiant. "Beverly, you never needed permission to be yourself. You just needed to stop listening to people who were threatened by your goodness." Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I'd been struggling to expand beyond my single location, worried about cash flow, and wondering if I was naive to think I could make a real difference. Tonight, I was running a program that served over 300 children across multiple sites with research partnerships and expansion plans that could impact thousands more. But the real transformation was internal. I no longer measured my worth by my family's approval or society's narrow definitions of success. I'd learned to trust my own compass, to value compassion over competition, and to understand that the most meaningful achievements often can't be quantified in ways that impress people at cocktail parties. Have you ever had someone believe in you when you couldn't believe in yourself? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding your worth and purpose. Share this with someone who might need to hear that their value isn't determined by other people's limited understanding of success. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money, but the confidence to trust your own heart about what really matters. Here's to surrounding yourself with people who see your light even when you've forgotten it's there.